I want to begin this discussion by asking a question. Why is it that there has never been even a single documented case of a congenitally blind person being diagnosed with schizophrenia? Why is it that people who have never gazed upon the world seem to be immune to this disease of the mind in which the boundaries of internality and externality become so horrifyingly warped? How could it be that the eyes, these small, gelatinous bodily organs, could have such a deeply rooted connection to the human sense of I-amness? Within the ever-present Origin, Jean Gebser recounts a single letter which he believes to be a perfect encapsulation of the situation of man at a threshold between two radically different worlds, two radically different modalities of human consciousness. The text in question is a letter written by the 32-year-old Petrarch in 1336, which recounts his ascent of Mount Ventoux in southern France. Gebser notes that it was within this region of France that the heretical tendencies of the Cathars had flowered. It was this particular geography within which the cerebral, transcendentalist spirit of Gnosticism had managed to germinate from beneath the domination of Roman Christianity. And it is no accident that it is also within this geography that Petrarch would unwittingly come to make a discovery of world-remaking consequence. The mountain called to Petrarch, but unbeknownst to Petrarch, what summoned him was in fact the death of an entire cosmos within which human consciousness had been safely sheltered for some 15,000 years. Petrarch's letter, addressed to an Augustinian professor of theology, carries a deeply confessional tone, as though Petrarch felt within him a deep sense that his discovery was somehow an immense transgression of a divine order. Petrarch states, quote, "Yesterday I climbed the highest mountain of our region, motivated solely by the wish to experience its renowned height." Petrarch was by no means the first man to summon a mountain, but as Petrarch recounts his arrival at his destination, his letter takes on an unusually somber, unsettled tone. Upon that summit, Petrarch was confronted with something which no mountaineer or any other human being had ever encountered before. He was confronted with space. Petrarch's journey was of singular significance in that it was intended specifically to experience a certain vista, a certain perspective on the landscape which lay before the mountain. Having achieved this vista between the worlds of heaven and earth, Petrarch was confronted by an inexplicable sense of dread. In this moment of desperate spiritual need, he opened a copy of Augustine's Confessions, searching for whatever passage his gaze might fall upon. In doing so, he chanced upon a remarkably appropriate passage in which Augustine had written, quote, "Men went forth to behold the high mountains and the mighty surge of the sea, the inexhaustible oceans and the paths of the stars, and in doing so, lose themselves in wonderment." But what exactly can it mean that Petrarch was confronted by space? From our modern perspective, Gebser's claim that Petrarch's journey was a discovery of space seems almost nonsensical. Space, to modern consciousness, would seem to be among the most basic, undeniable, and unquestionable conditions of human experience. How could it be that human consciousness once resided in a pre-spatial world? Here we must understand that space is by no means identical to the notions of locality or geography. Space is emptiness. It is something which, precisely due to its own formlessness, can only be encountered as a conceptual experience. Space is not simply location, but is rather an infinite, extensive void of potential perceptions. Pre-modern human beings did not find themselves beneath an infinite expanse of space, but rather they found themselves enclosed within the vaulted sanctuary of the heavens. The geography of the pre-modern world was not an undifferentiated, infinite expanse, but rather a very much heterogeneous landscape of significance and memories. We moderns tend to imagine space through the imagery of the three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system. a mathematical abstraction within which all locations and distances are regarded as fundamentally identical, interchangeable. It is only the contents of space which differentiate it. As such, space itself must be conceptually experienced as something invisible, which resides behind all appearances as a condition for the possibility of appearances. Space, in other words, is a conceptual abstraction, which is far, far less obvious than we might presume as modern peoples who simply take for granted the achievements brought forth by the birth of the perspectival world. Although Petrarch was not the first man to gaze upon the landscape before a mountain, he was the first to experience his own gaze, and the infinite expanse produced by it, as a conceptual experience. Petrarch's sense of almost sacrilegious spiritual malaise was not unwarranted either. In that moment of perspectival self-reflectivity, Petrarch was experiencing a threshold between heaven and earth, the blurring of a boundary which had sheltered the human soul since its inception. What Petrarch confessed in his letter was the intoxicating lure of wonderment, a temptation which would come to irreversibly transform the entirety of the planet Earth over the course of only a few rapid centuries. Petrarch's letter describes what was perhaps the first direct experience, however fleeting, of the coming world, but it was by no means the first intimation. Over the course of the late Middle Ages, a number of seemingly innocuous but immensely consequential pieces would fall into place, which would lay the groundwork for the perspectival world. During the 13th century, the Nominalist movement would arise among the scholastic philosophers of Christian Europe. The Nominalist movement proposed a new vision of reality which was almost unthinkably radical within the context of the Neoplatonic and Aristotelian cosmology, which had dominated Western thought for nearly a millennia. The Nominalist philosophers, such as William of Ockham, argued against the independent reality of universals. One of the most foundational tenets of Western thought since the golden age of Hellenic civilization was the distinction between transcendental forms and the fallen world of mere appearance. Universal forms were seen to be the archetypal composers of reality, transcendental powers which gave shape to the world through formal and final causality. The world of forms was understood as a world of necessity in contrast to the immanent world of contingency and accident. As such, this world of necessity was understood to sculpt and direct the world of mere appearance from on high. The Nominalist philosophers, however, argued that this conception of the world was one which robbed God of his ultimate omnipotence. If the forms are a realm of absolute necessity, so they argued, then this meant that in some sense God himself was beholden to that necessity. Conversely, if the forms were instead understood to be mere ideas, mere generalizations produced by the mind, then no such transcendental necessity would be imposed upon God, as the mind of God would be in complete control of the ideas which he wielded. God's freedom, in other words, would not be impinged upon by the power of the forms themselves. Although the Nominalists framed their disavowal of the forms with this argument, I nonetheless believe that this argument was a performative facade. If we look to the Aristotelian conception of the Christian God, we do not find a deity which is beholden to the forms. God is understood to be the unmoved mover, the ultimate final cause, which is effectively identical to the Neoplatonic monad, the form of formedness, which conditions the reality of the world, including the reality of all other forms. The necessity of the world of forms is ultimately derivative of the necessity of God, as the world of forms is understood to unfold from the absolute unity and perfection of the unmoved mover or monad, which the Aristotelians identified as God. If we take this Aristotelian metaphysics seriously, then the Nominalist argument seems extremely weak. All things considered, the Nominalist God wouldn't seem to be any more or less omnipotent than the Aristotelian God. If that is indeed the case, then what could have possibly motivated the nominalists to disavow a cosmology which seemed to be perfectly coherent, self-consistent, and well-established within Christian theology for nearly 1,000 years? What actually motivated the nominalists was, I believe, not the freedom of God, but rather the freedom of human beings. Aristotelian metaphysics distinguishes between the world of matter and the world of psyche. Matter is understood to be participation in the prima materia, the empty, formless receptacle or chora, which was understood to underpin all embodied existence. Psyche, conversely, was a realm of immaterial substance, a world in which there was no distance between potentiality and actuality. Psychical substance consisted of pure forms, pure actuality, and these forms then dictated the activity of living beings within nature. The growth of a plant was determined by the plant's vegetative psyche. The motions of a horse were dictated by its animal psyche, and the thoughts of the human being were determined by her rational psyche. The Aristotelian cosmos was by no means deterministic in the sense of modern physicalist science, but nonetheless, the Aristotelian conception of the human being was one in which the human organism was dictated by its psychical composition, and this psychical composition was not understood to be produced by human agency. Within this Aristotelian cosmology, the human soul consisted of the forms which constituted the psychical substance of the human organism. The soul was therefore understood as a particular confluence of forms, and the human will was thus understood to be the activity of these forms. There was no formless soul which could reside behind the psychical substance and direct the human being independently of these forms. In other words, human agency was determined by the psychical forms, and there was no deeper self which was independent of this formative composition. By rendering the world of psyche as one of mere ideas, the nominalists were thus covertly attempting to liberate the human being from the necessity of this psychical realm. Here, for the first time in human history, we are seeing a deeply rooted feeling which had come to demand the liberation of the human soul, a demand that somehow the individuality of a particular human person could be the master of his own thought, and by extension, his own actions and moral agency. Ultimately, the nominalist movement would lay the groundwork for the scientific age, as the disavowal of independent forms and psychical substance would condition a new understanding of truth, an epistemology which saw truth not as knowledge of the universal forms, but rather as knowledge of particulars. Although Petrarch's discovery of space and the nominalist movement might initially seem to be quite unrelated, what we will find here is a common thread which will show itself to be the core motif of the modern world. This theme consists of the particularity and immanence of the human subject and the free will of that subjectivity. What Petrarch discovered was the expanse of vision which radiates from the nexus of human perspectivity, and thus the power by which individual human subjectivity is able to disclose reality. What Petrarch found upon that mountain was the seemingly divine power of the individual human gaze. This was the discovery of the human subject as an inner space, and by extension, the discovery of the outer space which radiates from it. Correlatively, the nominalists had begun the process by which the world of ideas or forms would come to be seen as the contents of such an inner space, rather than as a world which existed independently of subjectivity. Through this process, we would come to see not only words, but concepts themselves as the activity of individual human subjectivities. To be clear, neither the nominalists nor Petrarch would have ever described their achievements in this way, because during their own age, human subjectivity itself was only dimly coming into focus within the horizon of our conceptual experiences. In other words, the notion of human subjectivity had yet to be explicitly conceptualized at all, but only intimated. When we look to Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy, we find no notions which could correspond to the modern concept of subjectivity. There simply was no notion of an inner space within which experiences occur, and such a notion would not be explicated philosophically until René Descartes' inward turn. Within classical philosophy, we find no distinction between mind and inanimate matter. Socrates never asks his interlocutors whether an insect feels pain when it is injured. Socrates never asks whether his experiences of red might be different than someone else's experiences of the same light. Socrates certainly understood that two different people might see different things if they look at an object from two different perspectives. The allegory of the cave is itself an illustration of this. The prisoners in the cave only see the shadows, but cannot see the totality which includes both shadow and object, a totality which the prison guards do see. But let us now pose a question. If I ask you where these different perceptions are happening, what would your answer be? I am not asking where the shadows are. I am not asking where the people are who are seeing those shadows. I am asking where are the experiences themselves? Within modern consciousness, we do in fact have an answer to this question. The experiences of the shadows are within the subjectivities of the prisoners. We can conceptualize the being of the prisoner as an inner world within which experiences occur. This way of thinking about subjectivity is so foundational to our modern consciousness that it is almost impossible for us to understand that pre-modern peoples completely lacked this way of understanding the world. If I asked Aristotle, where are the experiences of the prisoners, then Aristotle would say that they are happening on the cave wall, or at best, happening within the eyes of the prisoner. Aristotle, like other pre-modern thinkers, lacked a distinction between internal contents of experience and external contents of world. Within pre-modern thought, there simply was no notion of consciousness as a private inner space. Throughout the narrative we have covered thus far in this series of videos, we have seen the way in which the human ego has evolved over time. We have seen that human subjectivity has undergone various phases within which our self-conception has evolved. During the magical epoch, the human self was identified as the vital body. We experienced ourselves to be our vital life processes. Within mythical consciousness, we experienced ourselves as our sentient, behavioral agency. Within discursive consciousness, we came to experience ourselves as being our inner voices. But as perspectival consciousness slowly came to germinate in the wake of Christianity, human subjectivity would gradually begin to experience itself as subjectivity. Our own I amness would begin to conceptually experience itself as I amness. Through this process, the human ego would begin to awaken to itself as an inner world, and ultimately we would find ourselves in a cataclysmic confrontation with the absolute darkness of that inner world. Another significant intimation of this process can be seen in the radical metaphysics of the Italian philosopher and poet Giordano Bruno. Born in 1548, Bruno would come to champion a metaphysics which starkly contrasted with Christian Aristotelianism. Today, Bruno is typically depicted as a martyr for science who was persecuted and ultimately executed for his belief in an infinite pantheistic universe. Bruno argued that a finite universe was unbefitting of an omnipotent creator god, and thus declared that the Aristotelian cosmos was pathetically minuscule and monotonous. The Aristotelian cosmos was one which consisted of a hierarchy of concentric spheres. Beginning with the lowest realm within the center of the Earth and expanding outward, these spheres were each characterized by a certain archetypal composition. The moon acted as a mediator between celestial and terrestrial spheres. The sublunary world was understood as one of material substance, while the superlunary realm was understood as one of psychical substance. Beyond the firmament, one would eventually reach the primum mobile, the sphere of the fixed stars, and then finally the empyrean, the highest stratum of the heavenly domain, which consisted of pure divine fires. Giordano Bruno rejected this cosmology and instead espoused a form of heliocentrism, within which the celestial motions were understood to be a type of physical motion, not unlike that of corporeal bodies here on Earth. Bruno's conception of celestial motions was one in which bodies were compelled by either gravity or levity, the tendencies of objects to ascend or descend to the place in which they are most at home within the whole of a planetary system. Bruno argued that when an object is fully integrated into the whole which it forms a part of, the object becomes weightless and is no longer characterized by either levity or gravity. For example, if an object with the exact same density as water is suspended in water, then it will effectively become weightless and will attempt to neither ascend or descend. Similarly, Bruno argued that planetary bodies operate in exactly the same way. Since the planetary bodies are fully integrated into the whole of the solar system, the bodies are neither ejected from the solar system by levity or slowed down by gravity. They simply continue along their fixed curvilinear paths, as these paths are the trajectories along which the planets are most truly at one with the solar system as a totality. Although Bruno's conception of planetary motion might initially seem quite distinct from the Newtonian model, which would later become dominant, we should notice here that the core of Bruno's conception is a very clear foreshadowing of Newtonian gravity. Both Bruno and Newton would conceptualize planetary motions in such a way that the elliptical paths of the planets were understood as states of rest, and as such, that no active force needed to be at work in compelling such motions. Although his cosmological vision would eventually become obscured by the advent of Newtonian science, Bruno's understanding of the heavens would also lay the groundwork for the interdisciplinary astronomy developed by Rudolf Steiner during the 20th century. Through reconceptualizing the celestial domain in these ways, Bruno was able to envision a cosmos with no true center and no outer limits, a world which consisted of an infinite expanse of potentiality, an outer space which was in fact the inner space of the divine, or we might say, the subjective interiority of God. Bruno's most central and most radical departure from Aristotelianism, however, would consist in his reconceptualization of substance. Within Aristotelian cosmology, substance and matter were differentiated. While matter was understood as participation in the formless prima materia or chora, substance was instead understood as ousia, a term which was understood to refer to the immanent particularity of an entity. The ousia of an object was understood to be a unified identity which was formed through a particular coalescence of psyche and matter. Ousia, therefore, is not understood to be something independent of those formal qualities. If one stripped away the psychical and corporeal qualities from a human being, then that person would simply cease to exist. There would be nothing left over, as it were, apart from the psychical forms and their corporeal embodiment. Within the Aristotelian understanding, there is no deeper soul which lies behind the forms. In contrast to the Aristotelian doctrine of ousia, Giordano Bruno instead proposed a cosmology within which the fundamental basis of being consisted of a vast plurality of irreducible monads. While Aristotelian ousia was understood as a fixed substance which was defined and determined by the forms which adhere within it, Bruno's monads were instead understood to exist independently of both psychical and corporeal qualities. Each monad was conceptualized as being an entirely self-determined incorporeal entity, and each monad was understood to be an extension and reiteration of the universal, cosmic monad which was the being of God. Each monad was understood to be an agent of self-organization, and this self-generative activity was understood in terms of the distinction between implication and explication. In many ways, we can see Bruno's cosmology as a precursor of Leibnizian monadology, but his work is equally a precursor of David Bohm's holographic cosmology, which is also grounded in a distinction between implicate and explicate domains of existence. Bruno understood each monad to be a unit of interiority within which psychical, implicate contents could arise, which could then be explicated. It is through this process of explication that the psychical contents of a given monad are transferred from the private, inner space of the particular monad and into the shared intersubjective space of the natural world. It is through this process, then, that the spatially extended surfaces of corporeal matter come to arise. Thus we see in the cosmology of Giordano Bruno yet another instance of the underlying dynamics which would slowly give birth to the perspectival age. The interwoven principles of subjective freedom, individuality, inner space, and outer space, which would come to fracture the Aristotelian cosmos to its very core. Although Bruno's metaphysics would itself remain obscure during his lifetime, the transformations which drove Bruno's thought were nonetheless clearly and irreversibly at work already within the Western psyche. Looking at the art forms which were emerging during the Italian Renaissance, we can see that in spite of the continual dominance of the Aristotelian worldview, the Western soul was already awakening to inner and outer space in a manner which could not be suppressed or revoked. Before moving forward to discuss perspectival art, I want us to take a moment to look more carefully at exactly why this perspectival shift came to occur at all. Ultimately, we aren't going to be able to see the full scope of this transformation until we can bring the bigger picture into focus. That means delving much deeper into the way that Christianity came to transform the collective unconscious of Europe as a whole, and the way in which this underlying Christic impulse came to merge with the forces which resided within the Norse-Germanic peoples of Western Europe. For now, however, we can already see some of the ways in which the medieval world was inherently unstable. Christianity implied that all human beings were, at the most fundamental level, equivalently valued by God, yet, within the Aristotelian doctrine of ousia, the divine spark of the human being could only be understood as the rational psyche. The rational psyche consisted of a particular constellation of forms, and this meant that different human beings did not have the same rational psyche. Within Aristotelian metaphysics, there was no deeper soul which could be seen as equivalent for all human beings. Nominalism, conversely, implied that the human psyche was, at least in some sense, a blank slate rather than a complex of pre-existent forms. Likewise, Giordano Bruno's monads were all fundamentally identical in and of themselves. It could thus be said that all human souls were all equally divine sparks which were made in the image of God. Another issue with Aristotelian Christianity was its manner of conceptualizing the bodily realm. Living beings were understood to consist of both psychical and material substance. While psyche was understood to be determinate, intelligible, idyllic, and eternal, materiality was understood as the exact opposite, characterized by indeterminacy, hiddenness, imperfection, transience, and decay. While psychical substance was understood as pure actuality, matter was understood to be pure potentiality, which lacked being in and of itself. One could thus understand the materiality of an entity as its distance from being, its unreality, as it were. In the words of Plotinus, quote, "Everything that matter tells us is a lie, everything it pretends to be, it is not," end quote. In accordance with the discursive distinction between reality and mere appearance, psyche was understood as true reality, while materiality was effectively the formless form of mere apparentness. As such, Aristotelian Christians conceptualized human salvation as a kind of rebirth, in which the resurrection body, or glorified body, would consist entirely of psychical substance. This glorified body would consist of pure, psychical actuality, as the darkness, hiddenness, and formlessness of the prima materia would have been purged from its being. As such, the doctrine of Aristotelian Christianity effectively conceptualized salvation as a kind of dematerialization of reality. This manner of interpreting Christianity, however, brought with it some very serious theological problems. If materiality is to be understood as pure fallenness, then how can this be reconciled with the belief that Jesus of Nazareth was both fully man and fully God? Several medieval theologians, including Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, struggled with the possibility that Jesus' body might have been some sort of non-material matter, so as to see it as uncontaminated by the darkness of the Great Mother. Christianity also insisted upon the moral agency of individual human beings in a manner which was far more radical than perhaps any other religious tradition. The ultimate project of Christianity was to become Christ-like. The divinity of Christ was understood to be the identity of his personal will with the will of God. As such, becoming like Christ necessarily implied changing one's own inner will so as to bring it into accordance with the cosmic logos. Each human being was understood to be ultimately responsible for his or her own ability or inability to achieve this concordance. Within medieval Aristotelianism, however, human behavior was understood to be dictated by the composition of one's rational psyche. The forms which constitute the rational psyche were seen to determine human behavior. Insofar as the human being is identified as being that rational psyche, then we could say that a person's thoughts and actions are in some sense free, at least insofar as they are enactments of one's own rational psyche and not compelled by something external. So, in other words, if you are your rational psyche and your rational psyche is causing all of your actions, then you could say that all of your actions and decisions are being caused by you. As such, there was a kind of free will here, but nonetheless, the Aristotelian doctrine of ousia, as we have already seen, didn't allow for there to be any sort of truly unconstrained agency which could be seen to reside behind or beneath the rational psyche. This conflicted with the notion of ultimate moral responsibility, as a person could be said to be determined by the forms which constitute the rational psyche, while being unable to choose or alter that constitution. Another, equally crucial factor which would lead to the breakdown of the medieval worldview can be seen in the underlying Christian demand for personal authenticity. Christianity is, perhaps above all else, the promise of salvation through the Christification of the individual human person. The figure of Christ is understood to be the embodiment of the will of God. He is understood to be the cosmic logos, which generates and sustains reality. Becoming Christ-like, therefore, demands a fundamental accordance of one's own innermost will with the cosmic will, which is the logos. As such, Christianity places an immense and even paradoxical demand upon the human soul. It is never truly enough for a Christian to profess belief in a certain creed or adhere to a certain doctrine or code of behavior in order to truly become Christ-like. The innermost will of the human soul must actually become the logos, such that the human being's own inner will and the cosmic will come to be identical. What Christianity demands of the human being, therefore, is an absolutely authentic conviction. In order to truly align one's own inner will with that of the Logos and fully submit oneself to the moral demands of that Logos, the human being must believe in an absolutely authentic and self-assured manner that this Logos is indeed what the Christian narrative implies it to be. Other forms of Neoplatonic religiosity tended to be grounded in a purely transcendental world. Believing in the monad of Plotinus or the unmoved mover of Aristotle is ultimately a matter of pure reason alone. Christianity, however, is very different in this regard. Belief in Christianity must ultimately be a belief in the possibility of salvation for the individual human person. Here it is the resurrection of Christ, not merely as a symbol or allegory, but as a concrete, imminently historical event which is meant to solidify this belief in the salvific power of the Christian faith. Christianity demands ultimate moral and epistemological authenticity, and this authenticity of conviction can never simply amount to a conviction in abstract philosophical propositions. One must actually believe that the resurrection of Christ actually occurred in the natural world as a concrete historical event, which was, and I cannot emphasize these next words enough, actually witnessed by human eyes. The problem then, of course, is that those who are said to have actually witnessed this event are all long dead and had been for centuries, even by the time that Christian theology came to take on philosophically coherent forms. In a way that is utterly unique among all other religious traditions, the problem of belief came to be absolutely central to the Christian faith. The sort of unwavering conviction demanded by Christianity seemed to be virtually impossible, and yet at an unconscious level the Christian soul nonetheless held fast to the promise of salvation. This salvation, however, demanded absolute conviction, and such absolute conviction demanded absolute certainty. The Christian soul thus came to be compelled by the need to witness the truth of the cosmos with its own eyes. Deep within the core of the Christian psyche slumbered the unspoken knowledge that the absolute conviction demanded of it by salvation was only possible through the absolute confirmation bestowed by direct, immanent experience. With René Descartes, we see a metaphysics which was explicitly driven by the turmoils of doubt and faith. Descartes was compelled by the sense that mere profession of belief in the traditional worldview was simply inadequate to the demands of authentic belief. He therefore attempted to establish a new kind of theology which sought God through the pursuit of subjective certainty. And significantly, he sought the path to this certainty through the inner world of subjectivity itself, through the certainty of self-reflectivity. Cartesian truth, therefore, came to be grounded in clear and distinct ideas, which could be directly beheld by the mind, objects of awareness which were fully exposed to the scrutiny of incessant doubt. As such, Descartes intended to ensure that his ego assented to no beliefs other than those that he could freely commit himself to as both a rational agent and as a witness of immanent veracity. This innermost need to experience truth directly was inextricably interwoven with the correlative need for human freedom. As previously indicated, Christian salvation cannot be a simple adherence to rules or profession of belief. It is a demand that the innermost will of the human being be brought into alignment with the cosmic logos. The Christian soul cannot simply act in accordance with the logos. In order to achieve true salvation, the Christian soul must actually will the cosmic will. Anything less than such absolute inner commitment would inevitably give rise to the incessant turmoils of Christian guilt, the inner knowledge that one is simply going through the motions while being unable to genuinely believe and thus being unable to truly desire what the Christian soul wishes to desire. The Christian soul came to demand its own freedom precisely because of its own demand for authenticity of conviction. This demand for authenticity of both belief and will would be the driving force behind the nominalist disavowal of Aristotelian forms, as the nominalist saw the Aristotelian psyche as imposing itself upon the human ego from the beyond. This ego needed to be free in order to freely will the logos. We see the exact same underlying forces at work within the radical metaphysics of Giordano Bruno, whose philosophy was also one of spiritual liberation from the Aristotelian celestial hierarchy. Once again, we see the exact same forces at work within the Protestant Reformation. Protestantism rejected the Aristotelian worldview as well as the clerical tradition, as the clerical hierarchy was seen to unjustly pose as a mediator between the individual human soul and the divine. Protestantism thus emphasized direct human experience of the sacred, as it was compelled by the conviction that only such direct experience could result in the authentic inner transformation which Christianity demanded. Protestantism was fundamentally the rejection of the deferred faith which had been the central compromise of Roman Christianity. a deference in which a clerical class was expected to have faith for the rest of society, which was itself exonerated from the demands of such absolute moral and epistemic conviction. Although many traditionalists love to look at the past several centuries as a process of cultural and spiritual decay from some supposed golden age of Christendom, the reality is that the Romanized, doctrinal forms of Christianity were destroyed by Christianity itself, and this self-destruction was utterly inevitable. As we will see in more detail shortly, within the artworks of the Renaissance, the spatial depth which we see is the opening up of an inner world of human experience, which the Christian soul had been driven into by the Christian demand for personal conviction. Petrarch was driven to ascend Mount Ventoux precisely by the need to witness the expanse of the earth from a divine perspective, driven by an unspoken and deeply Christian conviction that the beheld is that which is most tangible, most fully real. Upon that summit, the overwhelming wonderment of the expanse was accompanied by an overwhelming dread. Within his depths, Petrarch felt his need to witness had placed him in the position of the divine itself, that he was now seated, much like the ascended Metatron, upon the throne of God. This overwhelming sense of sacrilegious self-deification was by no means unwarranted. As we will see, what Petrarch glimpsed in that moment was indeed the horizon of a coming world in which man would first truly find himself alone in the cosmos, as the measure and witness of all things. The medieval world of Aristotelian Christendom was fundamentally unstable in numerous ways, and ultimately it was Christianity itself which would shatter this medieval Christian world. The underlying Christian imperatives themselves would be the seeds from which the Protestant Reformation, modernist philosophy, and perspectival consciousness would come to emerge. The breakdown of Aristotelian theology wouldn't simply result in a reconfiguration of theological beliefs. It would result in the awakening of human consciousness to itself as a private inner world of subjective experiences, and this awakening wouldn't just shatter the medieval Aristotelian worldview. It would shatter the most basic cosmological notions which had sheltered human consciousness since the birth of civilization. And nowhere is the eruption of this new world more strikingly evident than in the visual artworks of the Renaissance. All genuine works of art can be understood as acts of eternalization. The creation of an artwork is an act of abstraction, which renders that which is depicted as a conceptual experience. Within the pre-modern metaphysics of Platonism and Aristotelianism, artworks are understood explicitly to be renderings of the eternal. Sculptures or murals which depict divine beings or mythological scenes are not intended to be realistic in the modern sense. They are not meant to appear as though they were being witnessed by human eyes, but rather are intended to capture the significant essences which are enclosed within the symbolic structure. All forms of art come to omit certain features of that which is depicted. The artist decides which features are most central to the essence of that which is depicted, and non-essential aspects can be ignored. Within pre-modern art forms, it is extremely rare to find artworks which render scenes as though they are being seen by human eyes from a certain vantage point. What pre-modern artworks depict is not the capture of a particular moment of human perception. Rather, they do quite the opposite, by rendering the timeless, spaceless reality of the symbolic world in such a manner that it is perceptible to the human senses. Following the advent of Christianity, however, we begin to see the emergence of a very different modality of art. These are the Fayum mummy portraits, which originated in Roman Egypt around the 2nd century AD. These portraits are unique in that rather than depicting mythical or archetypal imagery, they instead depict particular human persons, as they would have been perceived by the living eyes of their loved ones. The Fayum mummy portraits are not only intended to immortalize the dead, but more specifically, they are an attempt to immortalize particular moments of immanent human perception. moments in which a particular human face is beheld by another human being, both of which being fully grounded in the world of flesh and blood. These portraits, however, seem to have largely been of personal rather than cosmological significance. The portraits are intended to allow mourners to look upon the visages of deceased loved ones. Over a millennia later, however, the Italian Renaissance would see an immense resurgence of such perspectival emphasis. Rather than being of purely personal significance, the perspectivity of the Renaissance would instead be absolutely central to a dramatic cosmological shift of human consciousness. As we have already begun to see, one major factor in this development was the epistemological significance of Christianity. Christianity stands apart from other forms of Neoplatonic mysticism in that it hinges itself upon a specific historical event. In contrast, one's belief in the Neoplatonic form of the good needn't rely on any particular immanent facts about the world or any empirical observations. With Christianity, however, there is an absolutely central imperative to believe that the events of the Christian Gospels actually occurred historically, that Jesus of Nazareth was a particular human being who actually lived as a historical figure. The death and resurrection, therefore, are not Platonic forms which can be arrived at through purely conceptual dialectics. Rather, Christians needed to believe that these events occurred and believing that they were actually witnessed by living human eyes. Christian art, particularly during the Renaissance period and afterwards, came to serve as a kind of mediator of direct human experiences. The events of the gospel narratives came to be depicted artistically in such a way that the artworks imitated what would have actually been seen by an observer looking upon these scenes from a certain vantage point. Looking upon such artworks, therefore, came to serve an unconscious epistemological function in reinforcing the feeling that these events were truly immanent rather than purely conceptual. Within these depictions, we find that space has now become a core motif. The paintings are formed so as to imply the perception of depth, such that the painting itself appears to be a window through which the viewer is looking. Moreover, these depictions also contain an implicit metaphysical pyramid. As these grid lines show us, the space of the painting is a kind of projective field, which converges into the focal point of the viewer's perspective. Although this was undoubtedly an unconscious move on the part of the Renaissance artists themselves, this perspectival field is a symbolic inversion of the cosmic chain of being which characterized classical and medieval thought within the Western world. Within traditional Neoplatonic and Aristotelian metaphysics, the cosmos is understood to be a kind of layered pyramid. At the apex of this pyramid, we find the monad, the unmoved mover or the form of the good, the ultimate form of forms which conditions the possibility of all reality. As we move down this pyramid, we find more complex and specific elaborations of the archetypal principle embodied by this monad. As we descend further from the apex, we find layers of reality which are more densified, composite, and particularized, until finally arriving at the lowest layer of reality, the formless prima materia, or cora. This pyramid of being is one in which universality is regarded as more fully real than particularity. As we move down the pyramid, we move into realms of greater particularity, greater formlessness, and greater darkness, greater distance from the unifying apex of ultimate universality. Within Renaissance art, however, what we find is an implicit inversion of this cosmological scheme. The implicit perspectival pyramid converges upon the focal point of a singular, immanent experience of particularity, or it appears to radiate outward from the particularity of the subjective point of reference itself. In either case, we have an implicit affirmation of the singular, immanent experience in contrast to the universal. The base of this pyramid is all-encompassing as it expands indefinitely into the infinite distance, but the universality of this base is subordinated to the singularity of the focal point. As will become clearer moving forward, what is happening here is the unconscious reconceptualization of ultimate transcendence, which is now no longer being seen as ultimate universality, but rather as the ultimate singularity of subjectivity. We see this exact same inversion of the Platonic hierarchy within the metaphysics of René Descartes. Descartes' philosophy, much like that of the Nominalists and Giordano Bruno, was explicitly framed as a departure from the predominant Aristotelianism of his time. Descartes' metaphysics begins with systematic doubt. Descartes aspires to call into question all that can be questioned in an effort to resituate philosophy upon solid, incontestable grounds. Descartes himself was a mercenary and likely a double agent and spy within the 30 Years' War, one of the most bloody shadows of the Protestant Reformation. He had seen firsthand the horrors of a world which was being torn asunder by an inability to find solid metaphysical foundations which could ground disagreements about theological principles. Moreover, this was an era in which the world of European Christendom was being destabilized on many other fronts as well. The Americas had been discovered within living memory, resulting in immense economic and militaristic developments and thus resulting in rapid transformations of Europe's political landscape. This was also an era which would see the first stirrings of what would become modern science. The developments of Galileo and Kepler had begun to irredeemably shatter the Aristotelian interpretation of the astronomic domain, thus calling into question the whole of the Aristotelian cosmology and, by extension, leaving the world of theology on much less stable footing as well. Descartes' systematic doubt was therefore, ironically, rooted in the desperate need for absolute certainty, the need for an anchor which could ground the human soul within the midst of the chaotic tempest which had begun to make landfall. As such, Descartes' skepticism led him to doubt all that he might claim to know, doubting his beliefs about the world beyond his senses, and then doubting the world even as it appeared to his immediate perceptions, and finally coming to doubt even his own body and the contents of his own mind. Descartes thus retreated further and further into himself in search of that which could not be doubted. Finally, Descartes did arrive at that which could not be doubted, the source of all doubt itself, the perspectival ego. Staking his claim to this absolute certainty, Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am." Through this meditation, Descartes had achieved two monumental developments which would both come to be of pivotal importance within the narrative of human consciousness for the next 5 centuries. On the one hand, Descartes had brought himself into the first explicit awareness of his own selfhood as I amness, the first philosophically explicit awakening of subjectivity as subjectivity. On the other hand, Descartes had also achieved the first intimations of schizophrenia. There is an intimate relationship between doubt and the membrane which divides self and world. Calling the external world into doubt is itself a kind of externalization of one's own experiences of the world. It is a form of dissociation, precisely because the boundaries of the ego are determined in large part by the dividing line which separates that which can and cannot be trusted. Likewise, calling into doubt one's own body is a dissociation from the body. This dissociation can result in a sense of being imprisoned in one's own mind, and this dissociation is as much somatic as it is psychical. fMRI research has shown that many survivors of severe trauma tend to exhibit significantly less brain activity within a vertical band of the cerebral cortex, which is sometimes referred to as the mohawk of selfhood. These trauma victims also exhibit significantly less physical sensitivity than other individuals. If I place an object such as a key or coin in your hand, then you can likely tell me what the object is while blindfolded by using tactile sensations alone. Patients with decreased activity within this cerebral band, however, are often unable to do so. By dissociating cognitively from the body, these patients seem to have quite literally anesthetized themselves to their own bodies as a kind of defense mechanism. By ceasing to fully integrate the physical body into one's sense of selfhood, the body literally becomes more numb to physical and psychological pain. In other words, the re-territorialization of the boundary between self and world is not merely conceptual. It is a process by which the noetic, sentient, vital, and somatic layers of the human organism come to coordinate their relationships to one another within the continual self-generation of the organism as a whole. As such, dissociation from the thoughts inside one's own mind through chronic doubt can result in a devastating spiral, by which the perspectival ego comes to simply collapse into itself, as it comes to experience all other aspects of the extended self as external, alien forces. As we will come to see in more detail later on, this schizophrenic implosion is of immense danger to perspectival consciousness in particular, as it is through the development of perspectival consciousness that the human being must come to take conscious control of its own self-delineation. The neuroscientist and psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist has argued on similar grounds that René Descartes likely suffered from schizophrenia symptoms. McGilchrist considers these schizophrenic symptoms to be indicative of a disconnection between the left and right hemispheres of the cerebral cortex. Although I certainly do think that such disconnect is likely at play here, I think that the sense of selfhood is the deeper factor, as it is the self-delineation of the human ego, which conditions the integration of the disparate psychical and corporeal organs into a cohesive totality. Returning to Descartes' philosophy, we can see that this contraction of the ego was accompanied by a metaphysical contraction of subjectivity itself. The reason why we do not find an explicit notion of consciousness as such within classical or medieval philosophy is because there was not yet any differentiation between immanent existence and existence within a field of consciousness. The notion of blind, lifelessly objective matter simply did not yet exist, and as such, the notion of consciousness as a unique quality separate from being itself was not yet formulated either. Within Cartesian metaphysics, however, we find the first real demarcation of subjectivity and objectivity as two distinct domains of existence. In contrast to the classical notions of nous and psyche, Descartes comes to reframe the mental as subjective internality. Conversely, matter is then conceptualized as being external, extended surfaces. Only in the wake of this Cartesian turn does the notion of inanimate matter come to be possible, and it is this notion which would lay the groundwork for the birth of science from alchemy. It is here, then, that we find the first philosophical inversion of the Platonic hierarchy. Subjectivity itself, the very particularity of the human being, comes to be seen as that which is least in doubt and therefore that which is most fully real. As Descartes dissociates his own subjectivity from all of the contents of his experience, his subjectivity thus comes to fill the role which had previously been performed by ousia and the prima materia within Aristotelian cosmology. In other words, subjectivity comes to be implicitly understood as the ground of existence itself. Cartesian, perspectival subjectivity thus comes to be understood as the formless foundation of human existence, that which in itself is completely lacking in qualities, but which is the condition for the possibility of qualification, or what Aristotle would have termed the hypokaimenon. One question yet remains, however, which Descartes does not address explicitly. What exactly is this I amness? What exactly is the nature of this formless inner space which lies beneath all contents of human experience? And how is it that this strange something is able not only to think, but to think itself? Following the developments of the Renaissance and the Cartesian Revolution, Western thought would come to be obsessively fixated upon subjectivity. This was not a fixation upon consciousness or awareness in the more general sense which we find in Eastern traditions. It was rather a fixation upon subjectivity as such, subjectivity as the inner space of experience, which mediates between the interiority of the self and the externality of otherness. This relationship between the inner and the outer would become the most singular concern of Western metaphysics, epistemology, ontology, and theology, and would remain so unto the present day. We see early iterations of this fixation upon subjective experience in medieval alchemy, which was perhaps the first spiritual movement to insist upon direct empirical experience as the foundation of truth. Following the Renaissance and Protestant Reformations, the disavowal of Aristotelianism would result in the transmutation of alchemy into modern science. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus would publish On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, thus initiating what is now known as the Copernican Revolution. Within the mythology of modern science, the Copernican revolution is typically depicted as a process by which an outmoded, empirically inaccurate model of the solar system was eventually superseded by a more empirically rigorous model. In reality, the Copernican model was actually far less accurate in actually making astronomical predictions than the Ptolemaic cosmology which it challenged. Copernicus maintained the Aristotelian conviction that the heavenly bodies proceeded along circular paths rather than elliptical orbits, and consequently his model was simply less accurate than the Ptolemaic epicycles. Within Aristotelian cosmology, circles were considered to be perfect transcendental forms, while ellipses were regarded as deformations of that pure celestial order. To claim that the heavenly bodies didn't move in circular patterns would be to call into question the transcendental nature of the heavens themselves, and Copernicus simply was not radical enough to defy the Aristotelian worldview to such an extent. As such, his model of the solar system was demonstrably false, yet, as we will see, other forces were at work here beyond empirical evidence. Half a century later, Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei would finally make this radical break with the traditional worldview. Galileo's observations of craters on the moon and the moons of Jupiter would indicate that the heavenly realm was not one of immaterial, psychical substance, but rather that the heavens were in fact continuous with material nature. Simultaneously, Kepler would introduce the notion of elliptical orbits, which would finally bring Copernican heliocentrism into accordance with observation by defying the perfection of the Aristotelian heavenly spheres. Ultimately, however, we must also realize that at no point in this process do we find an empirical observation which finally solidified the heliocentric model or discredited geocentrism. In fact, when we look to modern science, what we find is quite the opposite. Modern science would ultimately come to disavow the notion of a fixed spatial background altogether, thus implying that there is no objectively real center to anything at all. Without a notion of an absolute spatial background, any attribution of centrality becomes arbitrary. If I have two bodies which are orbiting one another in a purely relative spatial void, then I have no way of establishing that one body is holding still and that the other is moving around it, because I have only relative motions to work with. I can create a model in which I pretend that one body is stationary and that the other is in motion, but there is nothing objectively real which can tell me which body is actually holding still. We simply do not observe a fixed spatial background, and without such a background, any point in space can be regarded as stationary without any alteration to physical laws, and this is because modern physics was intentionally designed to do this in order to maintain its mathematical universality. The reason is that without absolute space, there simply is no objective truth to the matter one way or the other. I can create a model in which I pretend that object A is stationary, or one in which object B is stationary. In either case, my model will perfectly accord with empirical observations. Likewise, there is absolutely nothing preventing us from simply returning to a geocentric cosmology. We could simply reframe our model such that the Earth is once more the center of the solar system, and this model would perfectly accord with both modern theories of gravity and all empirical observations, because it would be both empirically and theoretically equivalent to the heliocentric model. One could argue that it makes more sense to pretend that the Sun is stationary because the Sun is a larger object with more mass, and that doing so simplifies our models by removing the need for epicycles. However, one could just as well argue that the geocentric model is simpler in the sense that it better accords with our direct experience of the world. Choosing to pretend that the Sun is stationary on the basis of its mass is ultimately a value judgment. We are choosing to regard mass as more significant than any other features of celestial bodies, but one could also argue that the Earth should be privileged because the drama of life unfolds on the Earth and not the Sun. Ultimately, what we must realize here is that the transition from geocentrism to heliocentrism was not a transformation brought on by some clinical procedure of making falsifiable predictions and testing them against observation to discredit an older worldview and corroborate a new one. Rather, this was a transformation of cosmologies which was brought on fundamentally by a transformation of underlying metaphysics. More specifically, it was brought on by new vistas of possibility, which were made possible by the advent of perspectival consciousness. Copernicus was not motivated by the realization that a heliocentric model would be more empirically accurate than a geocentric one. He was motivated to develop his heliocentrism in spite of its inability to accord with empirical observations. What compelled Copernicus was his discovery of the relativization of perspective. Within his inner world of imagination, Copernicus realized that the solar system might look very different from different perspectival reference frames. As such, he saw the possibility that, from the perspective of the Sun, the solar system might appear to be much more harmonious than what would appear to be the case from the human perspective on Earth. This relativization of perspective points us towards a very crucial aspect of this narrative: the deeply interwoven nature of perspectivity and interchangeability. The exact same relativization of perspective which we see in Copernican heliocentrism would eventually become Galilean relativity. Galileo saw that by regarding motion as relative to certain frames of reference, he could formulate his laws of motion in such a way that they could be universally applicable regardless of reference frame. Different motions within different contexts could all be regarded as interchangeable with one another. During the 17th century, Isaac Newton would seemingly come to complete the Galilean and Keplerian project of naturalizing the astronomical realm, and he would do so precisely by further generalizing the principles of perspectival relativism and interchangeability. Newton came to fully relativize kinematics, and he would do so through a radical act of imagination. Intuitively, we might regard only stationary objects to be at rest. Moving objects require some sort of action to compel them, and in the absence of such impetus, an object will eventually arrive at a stationary state. Newton, however, came to relativize motion in such a way that he could redefine rest. Newton tells us that objects in motion stay in motion unless otherwise acted upon by an external force. What this implies is that if an object is moving in a fixed, straight-line trajectory through empty space, then it will simply continue to do so, because from the perspective of that object, it will be essentially stationary. In terms of Newtonian kinematics, there is no difference between the object as moving in a fixed trajectory and it being stationary while the world moves relative to the object. If motion is relative, then these two scenarios are identical. The object will experience itself as stationary unless there is a change in velocity. Newton himself would maintain a belief in an unobservable absolute spatial background in order to avoid some inevitable problems which would eventually arise within Einsteinian physics. but by reconceptualizing rest in this relativistic manner, Newton was then able to regard the heavenly bodies as objects which are attempting to move in fixed, straight-line trajectories through empty space. As such, trajectories are states of rest for those objects. Newton then argued that the force of gravity, the same force which pulls objects to the ground here on Earth, might act to bend these resting trajectories into elliptical orbits. Newton's absolute spatial background meant that true motion could be defined, at least in principle. But during the same time period, however, Gottfried Leibniz would already be arguing in favor of a fully relativized space without any absolute background, thus foreshadowing the eventual development of Einsteinian physics, within which time itself would come to be collapsed into space, thus creating a fully relativized, fully perspectival cosmology. Thus, we can see the manner in which the discovery of perspectivity resulted in the concordant discovery of interchangeability. Through these discoveries, Isaac Newton would inaugurate the advent of a fully mechanistic understanding of nature, and this mechanicism would subsequently culminate in the Industrial Revolution. Interchangeable vantage points would become interchangeable reference frames, and later they would also become interchangeable parts and mass-produced consumer goods. The last two videos of this series were largely concerned with pre-modern history, and so many of you listeners might be wondering how this narrative might accord with the many speculations about the antediluvian world which we find within the realm of alternative archaeology. Many alt-archaeologists point to evidence that they believe is indicative of an ancient, advanced civilization, which has been lost to history. They point to the many megalithic structures found throughout the world, for example, and to the fact that modern science still has no satisfactory explanations for how these structures were created using only Stone Age or Bronze Age technologies. These researchers highlight a number of ancient artifacts or monuments which they believe to be indicative of advanced technology, which may have existed prior to the Neolithic Revolution, the time period which academic archaeology claims to have been the birth of written language, agriculture, and complex social structures. To their credit, I will say that the alternative archaeology community does put forward a wealth of evidence which strongly indicates that the standard academic narrative is deeply flawed. Academic archaeologists tell us that prior to the Neolithic Revolution, all human beings lived as tiny nomadic tribes of hunter-gatherers without any sort of complex social organization or advanced culture. As I see it, this academic narrative is little more than a vestige of a very outmoded story of progress which came to prominence during the 18th and 19th centuries. European academics believed themselves to be the absolute pinnacle of human evolution due to having shed the superstitious baggage of the Christian worldview in favor of the mechanistic sciences. As such, these academics tended to construe human history as a narrative of gradual enlightenment, through which the powers of science and technology came to slowly uplift us from our fallen state as filthy, barbaric, superstitious savages. As can be very easily demonstrated, this narrative is absolute nonsense for a vast range of reasons which I won't be going over in this video. However, the inadequacy of this narrative does not necessarily indicate the adequacy of the narratives which are often perpetuated within the realm of alternative archaeology. Very commonly, we find that these alt-archaeologists argue for the existence of an advanced civilization which is insinuated to have been capable of written language, agriculture, and even mechanistic technologies. When discussing human life prior to the Neolithic Revolution, what we are talking about is magical consciousness. As we have already seen in detail in previous videos, magical consciousness is fundamentally pictographic in essence. This alone tells us that written language prior to the Neolithic would have been extremely rare, if not completely non-existent, as the conditions for such cognitive abstraction were simply not in place yet. Similarly, systematic agriculture is something that I believe we can safely rule out. As previously established, magical consciousness does not differentiate a distinctly human world from a non-human, natural world which exists beyond the bounds of our domain. As such, we wouldn't expect any sort of systematic agriculture before the Neolithic Revolution and the development of mythical consciousness, which does demarcate between human and non-human worlds. Given what we have established thus far, we can safely conclude that academic archaeology is simply projecting its understanding of modern hunter-gatherers onto our Paleolithic past. The bottom line here is that we know very little about what humanity was actually like prior to the Neolithic Revolution, but we can surmise that it was radically different than what textbooks would have us believe. Although magical consciousness is fundamentally tribalistic in nature, this doesn't preclude the possibility that higher-order social structures might have been possible, especially given the fundamentally telepathic nature of the magical structure. It could have been, for example, that many dozens or even hundreds of individual tribes could have been interwoven together into larger social bodies, which could have been capable of architectural achievements which go far beyond what is possible for individual tribes of hunter-gatherers. It is also very possible that such animistic and shamanic consciousness was capable of interacting with nature in ways which would seem utterly fantastical from our modern perspectives. As such, I'm not going to fully write off the notion that there may have been some sort of antediluvian civilization, granted that we are able to drastically reconceptualize what we have in mind when we use a word like civilization. When we use the phrase advanced civilization, we tend to imagine agriculture, written language, complex social hierarchies, and machine technologies. If we are going to take the notion of an antediluvian civilization seriously, then we need to be able to seriously rethink these unspoken connotations. The reality is that we simply do not find any of the machines that were supposedly in use by this alleged civilization. In light of this, certain alt-archaeologists have speculated that perhaps these ancient peoples destroyed all traces of this technology for some sort of ideological or religious reasons. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a theory which is making excuses for its own lack of evidence right out of the gate, and we should be very skeptical of theories which do this. Being empirical means formulating theories which accord with what we actually see and no more, not fantasizing evidence into existence which isn't actually there. The reason I decided to go on this tangent now is because the claims of advanced machine technologies need to be contextualized by the developments which actually led to the advent of industrialization in modern history. Here we need to be very careful not to fall into an overly naive and simplistic understanding of technological developments. Due to the mythology of modern techno-science, we might be led to believe that technological developments come about simply through advances in the human understanding of the world. We get smarter over time, so it is said, and this knowledge then results in technologies which drive civilization forward. This understanding of technological development is, much like the progress narrative of academic archaeology, nothing more than a fantasy, one which completely ignores sociological, religious, metaphysical, and cultural factors, let alone the evolution of human consciousness. So consider for a moment what sort of awareness needs to be at play in order to create a technology such as a steam-powered pump, one of the first technologies which would lay the groundwork for industrialization. One might presume that simply understanding how nature works is enough. If I can see that coal can be burned, then I can infer that this fire can boil water. If I understand that boiling water creates steam, and that steam creates pressure, then I can infer that this pressure might act to move a solid object, and so on. The reality, however, is that there was not a single scientific fact which went into the creation of the steam pump which was unknown to pre-modern peoples. In fact, there is abundant evidence that ancient peoples understood hydraulic dynamics far better than Europeans of the early modern era. If ancient peoples knew all of the relevant facts about nature, then why is it that steam-powered technologies didn't emerge until the early modern period? In order to understand this, we need to be able to understand the central role which is played here by abstraction. More specifically, we must understand the role performed by the modes of abstraction, which came to emerge following the Renaissance, namely relativization and interchangeability. In order to conceptualize the steam pump, it simply isn't enough to understand that coal can be burned or that steam creates pressure. One must be able to see that the heat produced by the burning coal is, in some sense, equivalent to the pressure created by the steam. One must see that the pressure created by the steam is somehow equivalent to the motions of the piston, and one must see that this motion is somehow equivalent to the water being pumped from your iron mine. In other words, creating the steam pump requires us to think in terms of a notion which is so abstract that we simply do not see it in nature at all. That abstraction is the notion of energy. Energy is such a fundamental notion within the modern worldview that this might seem like an odd statement. We tend to refer to essentially everything as energy in some sense or another. How can it be said that we do not actually see energy in nature if it is surrounding us at all times? We must realize, however, that this very generality of energy is its abstractness. We can refer to gravity, electrical discharge, burning coal, and chemical bonds all as energy, precisely because it is an invisible abstraction which cannot be identified with any particular object's qualities or processes. It is simply the abstract notion of the possibility of change itself. With this notion of energy, we can begin to see different types of processes, such as burning coal and pumping water, as equivalent, as interchangeable with one another. We can begin to imagine that there is an imperceptible fluid, which we imagine as energy, which can flow from the coal to the fire, from the fire to the steam, and from the steam to moving pistons. The reason why we do not see industrial or engine technologies prior to the modern age is precisely because such technological thinking is only possible within the context of the abstractions which drove the development of modernity itself. Thinking in terms of energy is simply not possible outside of the context of a mode of consciousness which is characterized by the notions of relativity and interchangeability. And that mode of consciousness, perspectival consciousness, is a very, very recent historical development. I am, of course, very aware that alt archaeologists have examples of artifacts which they believe to be indications of machine technologies. However, I very strongly believe that these are actually examples of something much more bizarre, partially because we do not find even a single instance of such technologies, but even more so because I believe that the kind of thinking required to create modern technologies was simply not possible prior to the European Renaissance. If we are going to speak of a lost antediluvian civilization, then we need to seriously rethink what we mean by civilization. And if we are to speak of lost ancient technologies, then we need to seriously rethink what we mean by technologies. As we saw in detail in the last two videos of this series, each modality of human consciousness has contained within its own foundations a fundamental tension which would eventually necessitate its own collapse, and the advent of the subsequent structure of consciousness. Magical consciousness was grounded in the underlying unity of humanity and nature, and ultimately the violence and primality of nature itself would result in the breakdown of this harmonious unity and therefore the advent of mythical polarity. Mythical polarity, likewise, would contain within itself an inner imbalance of light and darkness, order and chaos, heavens and earth. And this imbalance would ultimately result in the discovery of negation, and thus the advent of the discursive structure. Discursive consciousness, at least in the Western world, would then come to be destabilized by its own demand for epistemological and moral agency, thus resulting in the advent of perspectivity. Within perspectival consciousness, we once again find an innermost engine which is fueled by a fundamental imbalance. sense. Now, however, this antinomy becomes the incongruity of internality and externality. The core struggle of the perspectival age would become the seemingly irreconcilable confrontation between the inner world of subjectivity, which we had come to discover, and the objectivity of a world which, now more so than ever, seemed to be an incomprehensible alien force. Humanity was now poised to enter into a climactic confrontation with the Great Other. This confrontation would result in an almost complete reworlding of our planet, and the central battleground of this confrontation would be a Western soul, which, oftentimes in spite of itself, has remained thoroughly Christianized down to its very core. The dialectical unfolding of this antinomy of subjectivity and alterity is what we refer to as the history of modernity. As we have already begun to see, the advent of modern science was the advent of a thoroughly empiricist understanding of nature. Subjective experience was now regarded as the ultimate arbiter of knowledge about the natural world, if not reality itself. This empiricism, however, would come with the additional and almost universally unspoken implication that only sensations are truly empirical experiences. And here we need to understand why this is and what this nuance truly amounts to. Once again, we should recall that the nominalist movement first promoted the notion that ideas are not forms that reside in the world itself, but rather are generalizations, abstractions which are only real within the human mind or the mind of God. This would result in yet another notion which has become so foundational to modern consciousness that it is almost impossible for us to realize just how uniquely modern it is. The notion that concepts are actually created by the human mind and used as a kind of filter for human experiences, in contrast to the traditional notion that concepts, or forms, are actually contents of the world in itself. Quote, "And as there is evidently nothing subsisting in disconnection from extended, that is, physical objects perceived by the senses, the thoughts are within the perceived forms, as are the abstract predicates and the various states and affectations of the things perceived." Aristotle on the Soul. As bizarre as this might seem to our modern eyes, what Aristotle is stating here is that thoughts are things that subsist within the world and thus are perceived by the human mind rather than things which are actually produced within human subjectivity. What Aristotle is claiming here is something that was simply taken for granted as obvious by pre-modern peoples. Yet by the time of the early modern period, the exact converse would be taken for granted by the British empiricists such as John Locke, David Hume, and Isaac Newton. During the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas would claim that, quote, "intellectual knowledge in us has its origin from sense." Thomas Aquinas, however, was an Aristotelian and certainly not a British empiricist. Aristotle had contended that form is inseparable from substance, but the Aristotelian world was characterized by both material and psychical substance. As such, it could be argued that forms could be perceived within psychic substances independently of the human senses by use of higher faculties. Aquinas, however, is taking the more radical position that our perceptions of forms are necessarily mediated by the senses, and thus mediated by material substance. As such, we can see his proclamation as a foreshadowing of scientific empiricism, but nonetheless, Aquinas did affirm the traditional view that forms actually subsist in the world, rather than being fabrications of the human mind. In the early modern period, John Locke would similarly claim that, quote, "there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses." But Locke would imply something far more radical in this claim. Locke would imply that all of our knowledge about the external world was in fact sensory information about physical facts. Here, Locke would distinguish between what he termed primary qualities and secondary qualities. Secondary qualities for Locke were purely subjective affects of the perceiver. The smell of a rose, for example, or the redness of its petals would be considered secondary in the sense that these qualities only existed within the human subject, not in the world itself. The world itself then consisted only of primary qualities, which were understood to be objective facts about physical bodies defined by extended surfaces. All subjective qualities were thus understood to reside within the human mind alone, and these subjective aspects of experience included the conceptual contents which were seen to be applied to the experience by the human mind from within. What this then implies is that the objective world in itself consists only of physical facts such as weight, mass, hardness, acceleration, or density, qualities of extended surfaces, which were understood to be truly real, precisely because they were not relative to the subjectivity of the observer. This manner of conceptualizing reality, however, would bring with it many less desirable implications. During the 18th century, the Scottish philosopher David Hume would begin to unfold the truly deconstructive implications of sensationist empiricism. Hume divided human knowledge into two basic categories: matters of fact and relations of ideas. Matters of fact were understood to be the properties of physical objects, which were made available by the human senses. Relations of ideas were truths which pertain to how the definitions of ideas determine their meanings. The statement, "there are no married bachelors," is necessarily true, not because it actually tells us anything about the world, but rather simply because of the definitions of the terms married and bachelor. In contrast to classical philosophers, David Hume believed that there really were no conceptual contents of reality, and thus believed that the only true matters of fact were achieved by physical sensations. As a consequence, this implied that no generalization could ever be an actual matter of fact. If I state that I am seeing the sunrise, then that is a fact about a sensory experience. However, if I claim that the sun will rise every morning, then I am making a generalization which can never be confirmed by any amount of sensory observations. No matter how many times I've seen the sun rise in the past, I still have no evidence that the sun will rise tomorrow. In order to make that claim, I need to be able to say that there is some general principle, some law of nature, or rather some form, which necessitates that the sun will actually rise. However, we never actually make contact with any such laws of nature through our senses. I cannot reach out and touch a universal law of motion, or see a gravitational constant. When we look to the Newtonian laws of motion, for example, what we find are equations, concepts which are created by the human mind as generalizations. According to Hume, there is no way to establish that these laws are valid through pure reason. Reason alone can only tell us about how ideas relate to one another, not how they might apply to the natural world. As such, we can never truly justify the inductive inference, which must be made in order to actually ground scientific knowledge of any kind. The best we can say is that Newton's laws, for example, accord with every observation that we have made thus far, but we have no means of justifying the belief that these laws will continue to hold sway tomorrow. Sensations alone cannot tell us what generalizations will continue to be true, but only which ones have been true thus far, and even that is assuming that our memories are actually reliable, which is itself a groundless generalization within Hume's epistemology. Ultimately, David Hume himself would essentially just sweep these problems under the rug. He suggested that we make such inductive generalizations simply on the basis of culturally enshrined habits or customs. If we take this solution seriously, then what this implies is that there is no universal grounding of truth which is independent of cultural context. We are left with little more than the ability to say that our truth is true for us given a certain historical and cultural milieu. In biting this bullet, Hume would foreshadow the entire movement of postmodernism, which would come to embrace this nihilistic relativism in immensely self-destructive ways. Although this solution might have seemed adequate to David Hume, it certainly didn't seem so for his successor, Immanuel Kant. Kant, born in 1724, would prove to be the single most significant philosopher of the modern era. The metaphysical system which he established within his Critique of Pure Reason, published in 1781, would lay the groundwork for the epistemology of modern science unto the present day. In an even more general sense, Kant's philosophy would prove to be the foundational text in establishing the Western disposition towards the relationship between subjectivity and world. It is no accident that it was a German who would come to see Hume's relativism as an immense problem in desperate need of a solution. Germany was the central nexus of the 30 Years' War, a horrifically bloody and protracted display of the consequences which unfold when a culture is unable to find common ground for questions of ultimate truth, and the very same conflict that undoubtedly contributed to Descartes' own metaphysical revolution. Kant saw very clearly just how devastating Hume's epistemic nihilism could prove to be, and he sought a solution by, once again, turning his scrutiny to the nature of human subjectivity itself. Kant would unfold Hume's bifurcation of facts and ideas into a quadrant, a fourfold understanding of knowledge which was divided by two axes. The first axis would concern how knowledge was justified, distinguishing between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. While a priori knowledge is justified through reason alone and can thus be known prior to experiences, a posteriori knowledge is justified by experiences. The second axis would then concern objects of knowledge, distinguishing between synthetic knowledge, that is, knowledge about the world, and analytic knowledge, which is knowledge about ideas in themselves. Through this quadratic formulation, Kant could then elaborate four distinct possibilities of knowledge. The first two forms of knowledge, the analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori, essentially correspond to Hume's relations of ideas and matters of fact, respectively. Analytic a priori knowledge is knowledge about ideas which is achieved through deductive reasoning. Synthetic a posteriori knowledge is knowledge about the world which is achieved through sensory observations. This then leaves two more categories. These are the analytic a posteriori and the synthetic a priori. The analytic a posteriori would consist of knowledge about ideas which was garnered through observations of the world. Fatefully, Kant would declare this form of knowledge to be impossible, though, as we will see later on, it is precisely the analytic a posteriori which will prove to be the exit from the Cartesian prison which Kant was attempting to escape from. Nonetheless, it was the synthetic a priori which would become the central focus of Kant's work and the cornerstone of his entire metaphysics. The synthetic a priori would consist of knowledge which was about the natural world, but which was established through reasoning alone, prior to sensory observations. What Kant had come to believe is that there must be ways in which human consciousness, due to its own necessary features, acts to structure our experiences of the world in universal ways. Synthetic a priori knowledge, therefore, would consist of knowledge about the fundamental, necessary attributes of human consciousness which condition the ways in which the human mind comes to render the world to itself within experience. Kant believed that the most crucial and foundational condition for the possibility of subjective experience itself was the unity of apperception. Kant saw the unity of apperception as the cohesion of the various aspects of human experience, the manner by which the mind was able to synthesize its sensations and thoughts into a coherent whole. This coherence of experience is necessary, Kant tells us, precisely because this coherence is the I amness, which is the necessary background of all experience. In order for experience to be possible at all, the contents of experience must be orchestrated in such a manner that there is a singular I am, which can serve as the receptacle of experiences. Furthermore, this I amness, or subjectivity, must be delineated in relation to an external world such that interiority and exteriority can be defined in relation to one another. If my mind did not achieve such a unity of apperception, then there would be no subjective experience at all, as the basic conditions for the possibility of subjectivity would not be met. Building upon this insight, Kant would go on to argue that the requirements imposed by the unity of apperception necessitated that all human experiences of external reality be organized in relation to a number of synthetic categories. Organizational principles which are able to synthesize our experiences in such a way that the unity and delineation of the I amness is maintained. These categories, such as space, time, and causality, can therefore be said to be prior to all experiences, as they are conditions for the possibility of experience. By understanding these categories, we can therefore achieve knowledge about what all human experience must be like, regardless of what the world in itself might actually be, and irrespective of cultural contingencies. Through this metaphysics, Kant believed that he had come to rescue the objectivity of human knowledge by internalizing the universal. But in doing so, Kant came to debar us from the world in itself. Kant seemed to show that we can only ever have genuine knowledge about our own internal representations of the world, as our experience necessarily serves as a kind of filter or screen, which forever separates us from reality itself. There would appear to be no way to step outside of our experiences and compare what we see with what the world is actually like independently of us. According to Kant, we do have access to a shared world of phenomena. Because our minds all must structure reality in similar ways, we can rest assured that we do experience reality in fundamentally similar ways, but ultimately this universality derives from the fact that we are all locked inside of essentially identical prisons of subjectivity. Kant thus distinguishes between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. While the phenomenological realm can be understood and encountered directly, the noumenal realm is that which is ever beyond us. We can never make any real, direct contact with the true underlying reality of other beings beyond our own subjectivity if our experiences are essentially an impenetrable shell which forever encloses us within the self-certainty of the Cartesian ego. Noumenal reality, the world as it is in itself apart from subjectivity, is something which is forever unknowable to us within this Kantian framework. The great other, that is nature, is thus forever separated from us by an impenetrable wall, and we can only speculate that there actually is an otherness beyond that wall. Our scientific knowledge can only ever be valid insofar as it accords with how our minds structure reality. Our knowledge about nature, therefore, is ultimately no more and no less than knowledge about ourselves, and anything we might believe about the world in itself must be relegated to the domain of religious faith. At this stage, we can now see perspectival consciousness in its most fully elaborated form, at least insofar as it remains efficient and has yet to implode upon itself in a schizophrenic death spiral. Within the ever-present origin, Jean Gebser discusses perspectival consciousness extensively, but ultimately he regards perspectival consciousness as a late-stage form of the discursive structure, rather than a structure of consciousness in its own right. This was, I believe, a massive oversight on the part of Jean Gebser. As I will now elaborate, I believe that perspectival consciousness is indeed a structure of consciousness unto itself, independently of the discursive structure, for several reasons. The first reason is that, like all of the other structures, the perspectival structure can become deficient by dissociating from the structures which underpin it, including the discursive structure. As previously indicated, the deficiency of perspectival consciousness is exemplified by schizophrenia, and we see this exact same dissociation at play within postmodernist anti-realism. One of the most iconic symptoms of schizophrenia is hearing voices. Voices that are not experienced as one's own thoughts, but rather as an external presence. What this indicates is that within schizophrenia, the perspectival ego has fully imploded into the void of pure subjectivity in such a manner that all other aspects of the human organism, including the discursive aspects, have become disidentified. The ego comes to feel itself to be pure subjectivity and nothing else, thereby sinking into the groundless, abyssal hall of mirrors, which is disembodied subjectivity. In the previous episode, we began to examine the way in which the Kabbalistic tree of life can be seen to diagram the structures of consciousness. Here, we can now begin to see how the sense of self-locality moves upward through the human physical body over the course of this evolutionary process. As we will see, the sense of where we literally feel ourselves to be inside our own bodies is distinct for each structure of consciousness. Beginning at the lowest level, we find the Sephirah Keter, correlating with the planet Neptune and what is termed the root chakra within Indic philosophy. The root chakra is therefore the point of contact between distinctly human consciousness and the pre-egoic awareness of the archaic structure. Moving upward, we then arrive at Da'at, correlating with the planet Pluto, the sacral chakra and the magical ego, which becomes the Freudian id. As one would expect, the sacral chakra is associated with physical vitality as well as sexuality and primal instincts. Next, we arrive at Tiferet, correlating with the sun, the solar plexus chakra, and the stellar soul of the mythical structure. As we saw previously, the stellar soul is correlated with elemental air, and the solar plexus is a nerve center which controls breathing within our autonomous nervous systems. Governed by the sun, the solar plexus chakra is associated with self-esteem, self-efficacy, and individuality. As the ego ascends from the mythical structure to the discursive structure, the stellar soul then becomes the ego ideal, guardian angel, or daimon. Yesod is then correlated with the moon, the heart chakra, and the lunar soul of the mythical structure, which will later become the anima, or animus. Governed by the moon, the heart chakra is associated with familial and romantic emotions, empathy, compassion, and emotional pain. Next, we then have Malkut, correlated with the planetary archetype of the earth, the throat chakra, and the discursive ego, which will later become the superego. Just as the earth is the convergence point within which cosmic forces are combined in creative life activity, the throat chakra is likewise associated with creativity and self-expression. Much like the discursive structure, it also governs communication and linguistic thinking. Lastly, for now, we then have the third eye chakra, associated with the perspectival ego. Here we need to go beyond the traditional associations of the Tree of Life and traditional planetary archetypes, and I believe that the planetary archetype which is most appropriate here is the planet Vulcan. Within Greek mythology, the fires which uplift humanity are brought down by Prometheus, the Titan god of forethought. But the fires themselves did not belong to Prometheus, but were rather stolen from Vulcan. Vulcan is the god of volcanoes, representing the sudden eruption of unexpected change into the world, and he is also the god of the forge, which we can see in the immensely rapid technological developments which followed the birth of perspectival consciousness. But on an even deeper level, I believe that Vulcan actually represents the ultimate destiny of human consciousness, and by extension, the Earth as a whole. Vulcan is a god of magma, which is itself a syzygy of fire and earth. As we elaborated previously, fire represents thought and the highest realms of the heavenly order, the Empyrean. Stone, conversely, represents the lowest form of matter. Elemental earth is the realm of bone and death. It is a state representing the greatest concretization and somnolence of the bodily domain. Magma, therefore, can be understood to represent the spiritualization of the bodily realm, and it represents the Ouroboros union of the transcendental and immanent domains of reality. Within his esoteric cosmology, Rudolf Steiner stated that the final phase of the Earth's evolution would be what he called future Vulcan, a state in which the entire Earth would be spiritualized into what is essentially a kind of superhuman meta-consciousness. Just as volcanoes mediate between underworld and overworld, we will likewise see that perspectival consciousness stands at the threshold between the corporeal and psychical domains of our own composition. Similarly, just as magma represents the syzygy of heavens and earth, perspectival consciousness will ultimately amount to the awakening of the human destiny, which compels us unto the redemption of the earth through the incandescence of the physical. The third eye chakra is also associated with the pineal gland, and within Western philosophy, René Descartes was the first to indicate that the pineal gland was a kind of bridge between the psychical and corporeal domains of reality. As our consciousness has evolved over the course of history, our sense of where we feel ourselves to be centered within the human body has come to shift. The human ego has been gradually ascending through the chakras, as illustrated by the serpent's ascent within the yogic traditions. In classical Greek and Roman sculpture, eyes were typically featureless spheres, with the iris and pupil being painted on after the sculpture itself was completed. During the late Roman period, however, sculptors began drilling holes into the eyes of busts and statues to represent the pupils. We had begun to see the eyes as windows into the human soul, as the human soul was beginning to be seen, though still unconsciously, as a receptacle of subjective experiences. Perspectival consciousness is deeply connected to the human eyes, both in symbolic terms as well as neurophysiological terms. Descartes claimed that the pineal gland was the seat of the human soul because he had come to experience his own egoity in such a manner that he felt himself to be located behind the eyes, within the dark interior of the human skull. Vision is a sensory faculty which stands apart from sensations such as tactility and thermoception, in that vision is most directly related to subjectivity as such, while feelings of texture and warmth necessarily involve identification with the body and, by extension, the lower structures of human consciousness. Vision involves very little bodily contact with the world beyond the subtle movements of the eyes themselves. Vision also stands apart from hearing in that visual perception is highly personal in a way that sound is not. Hearing is in many ways a highly interpersonal faculty. Sound spreads out and fills spaces, and human ears are able to detect sounds from a variety of distinct sources simultaneously. Various people can hear the exact same sounds, even if they are standing in different locations, and the sound will only differ in terms of volume or an equalization for listeners located at different places. Vision, however, is highly dependent upon the perspective of the observer. When two people look upon the same object from different vantage points, they will tend to witness very different visual impressions, even if the object is recognizable from both vantages. What you see with your own eyes is therefore quite personal to your specific situation in that exact moment. To walk a mile in someone else's shoes might be challenging, but to literally see the world through their eyes is virtually impossible. Vision, therefore, is the sensory faculty which is most intimately related to our capacity to be aware of ourselves as an internal world of experiences, which are distinct from the externality of reality itself. If the perspectival ego comes to be over-identified with to an extreme extent, it may then come to dissociate itself from the body as well as from the other structures of consciousness represented by the lower chakras. Through this dissociation, the perspectival ego thus effectively becomes an inner prison of pure internality, which is catastrophically alienated from the world. This, therefore, would appear to be why there has never been even a single case of a congenitally blind person being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Lacking vision even from birth, such individuals simply are not able to over-identify with the perspectival ego to such an extent that complete dissociation from the lower chakras becomes possible. Psychodynamic theorists who have attempted to understand and treat schizophrenia, such as Harold Searles and Harry Stack Sullivan, came to understand schizophrenia as primarily a disorder of self-conceptualization. Due to severe early childhood trauma, particularly trauma related to early caregivers such as the mother, the individual ego is unable to properly territorialize itself in relation to the world. The self-delineation of the schizophrenic ego is thus inherently unstable. The schizophrenic can never feel a sense of genuine certainty with regards to the membrane between self and other, and therefore the schizophrenic ego becomes far too fluid, expanding outward in ways that go beyond what is socially appropriate or contracting into itself in a recursive, implosive spiral as a means of self-defense. The anthropologist and semiotician Gregory Bateson would come to conjecture that schizophrenia arose precisely due to what he called a double bind in early childhood development. This double bind is said to be a situation in which the developing child is faced with contradictory messages from a caregiver, most notably the mother. The mother might, for example, demand affection from the child while also insisting that the child is inherently immoral or burdensome, or the mother could be physically abusive when intoxicated but might then become nurturing and affectionate when sober. These contradictions then put the child in an impossible situation, one which the child cannot escape from and which it is simply unable to make sense of at such an early age. This inability to render comprehensible the boundary between self and mother therefore results in an ego which is never able to clearly or confidently navigate the boundary between self and other in general. The ego comes to be an inherently unstable structure, as it is the mother-child relationship which is the primordial relationship of self-delineation. As we saw in our previous video regarding the trauma of birth, the ego emerges through fissioning apart from the consciousness of the mother. Throughout early childhood development, this process continues, as the ego is gradually forced to further individuate itself from the mother and to establish the boundaries of its own selfhood as it does so. When this process is distorted by extreme circumstances, the ego never comes to establish a sense of certainty with regards to the boundaries which define it, and as such, the ego finds itself in a constant state of paranoia, rage, confusion, and desperation. Here we can thus already begin to see that schizophrenia is not simply a personal neurosis, let alone a mere neurological malfunction. Schizophrenia is the central malaise of modernity itself at individual and collective scales. But to fully understand why that is, we need to put a few more pieces into place. To continue my argument that perspectival consciousness is in fact a distinct structure in its own right, I will also contend that it is characterized by a unique dimensionality in the exact same manner as the structures we have addressed previously. As we have already seen, the magical structure is characterized by monodimensional resonance. The mythical structure is then defined by polarity, and the discursive structure by triality. Perspectival consciousness is then characterized by the fundamentally fourfold nature of spatiality. The quadratic nature of perspectivity can be seen in numerous ways. Perspectivity was ultimately set in motion by Christianity, and the central symbol of Christianity is, of course, the crucifix. The first philosophical expression of perspectival subjectivity was achieved by René Descartes, who also developed the Cartesian coordinate system, a model which allowed for an understanding of space which would serve as the groundwork for the development of mathematical physics. Space itself is sometimes described as three-dimensional, but this is, I believe, a purely mathematical illusion which fails to actually account for the phenomenology of space itself. We call space three-dimensional because we use three number lines to model space, x, y, and z axes of the Cartesian coordinate system. But these axes are all measures of exactly one actual property, and that is distance. If I have a universe which consists of nothing more than emptiness and two infinitesimal monads, then a single line can connect both monads regardless as to what their positions are. We can imagine that these 2 points are moving up, down, left, and right within this imperceptible space, but in terms of what is actually tangible, there is only one real type of change which is possible within this universe: the lengthening or shortening of the line. These points can be either closer together or further apart, and therefore the only tangible thing that the line can do is extend or contract. If we try to imagine the line rotating in some way, we would need to imagine a background of other objects in order to even visualize this motion, as such motion would have to be defined in relation to something. If I then add a third monad to my imaginary universe, then I will now need a plane, which can account for all possible positions which the 3 monads might assume in relation to one another. The flat plane represents the entire possibility space which is defined by our 3 monads. Our plane can expand or contract in terms of length or width as is needed, but we will only ever need a plane in order to account for any and all possible arrangements of the 3 monads. Once we add a 4th monad, however, neither a line nor a plane can capture the possibility space defined by the 4 entities. In order to capture all of the possible positions of the monads in relation to one another, we need a sphere. Namely, a sphere which has an indefinite radius in the exact same manner that our initial line had indefinite length and our plane had indefinite length and width. Significantly, no matter how many more monads we add to this imaginary universe, we will never need anything other than a sphere to capture all possible arrangements of distance between the monads. Recall again how we initially defined dimensionality within the context of the ever-present origin. For Gebser, dimensionality is phenomenological. It is a measure of the ways in which consciousness is able to relate its contents to one another in terms of fundamental meanings. Within space, it is distance, or rather separation, which is the fundamental form of relationality. It is the measure of disconnect or alienation between entities in the world. It is a relationality which is fundamentally spherical in essence and which is fundamentally quadratic in the sense that this sphericality is revealed by relations between 4 or more entities. We can see another illustration of the basic relationships between the sphere, tetradicity, and the general concept of separation within the 4-color theorem. The 4-color theorem states that in order to colorize any spherical map such that no borders are touching between regions of the same color, then exactly 4 colors are needed. No more than 4 colors will ever be needed to ensure an adequately differentiated map, and this can be proven to hold true for all possible maps. For other geometric structures, this is not necessarily the case. For a toroidal map, for example, 7 colors would be needed to ensure color separation between regions for all possible maps. Significantly, the 4-color theorem is a conjecture about maintaining separation within a spherical topology. What this implies is that we find this tetradicity within the 4-color theorem for the exact same reason that we find space itself to fully emerge with the addition of a 4th entity in our imaginary universe. In both cases, the most basic element is that of separation, and in both cases we find that both sphericality and tetradicity come to emerge from the more primordial principle, that is, indefinite differentiation. Finally, we should also remember that human eyes are themselves spherical organs, and in the encounter between human selfhood and human otherness, we find a meeting of 4 such spherical organs. It is this fact, actually, which I believe brings us closest to seeing what the underlying tetradicity of space actually amounts to. In order to visually perceive a world at all, there is an absolute minimum of 4 entities needed such that subjectivity is able to perceive the semi-spherical field of projection which extends outward from it. In order for there to be relations between self and otherness at all, it is not enough for being to be divided. Rather, it must be crucified. Here I should also clarify that this is another topic within which Jean Gebser and I don't fully agree. Gebser, of course, doesn't regard perspectival consciousness as a distinct structure, and therefore doesn't attribute a distinct dimensionality to it. Gebser instead regards the sphere as embodying the dimensionality of the subsequent structure, which he refers to as the integral structure. As we will see later on, however, I believe that Gebser was getting ahead of himself, and overlooking a morphological structure which is equally significant in terms of symbology and relevance to natural science, namely the toroid. In the previous video, we began to see how the process of consciousness evolution is characterized by simultaneous processes of katabasis and anabasis. As our sense of self has moved upward through the organizational strata of the human organism, our experience of the world has undergone a correlative descent. Within perspectival consciousness, the capacity to experience the world as vital forms is stripped away, leaving only elemental earth. In other words, scientific physicalism. Medieval Aristotelianism had, much like Eastern traditions, conceptualized the natural world as a kind of liquidous, formless vitality that was then differentiated by the forms which constitute transcendental psyche. As we have already seen, the advent of the perspectival structure was concordant with a disavowal of the Aristotelian cosmology. Rather than conceptualizing nature in terms of the formless cora or prima materia, René Descartes would instead conceptualize the natural world as fundamentally characterized by extension. Nature would come to be understood in terms of the extended surfaces which defined physical bodies, and this definition of nature would remain foundational for modern science until the quantum revolutions of the 20th century, at which point science would essentially forfeit any attempt to actually define physicality at all. Here we can now see that extension and subjectivity share in a common essence. As we have already seen, Descartes understood his own consciousness in terms of the demarcation between internality and externality. The Cartesian perspectival ego is thus defined precisely by a kind of metaphysical barrier, which separates the inner space of subjectivity from the outer space that is the world. The Cartesian definition of physical matter is an exact mirror image of this. Nature is understood to consist of physical bodies, which are themselves defined by extended surfaces, boundaries which divide the interiority of the physical object from its exterior. It is here, then, that we see one of our first, rather blatant clues to the riddle which is unfolding. That the noumenal realm lying forever beyond our sensory impressions is in fact the interiority of otherness. For the first 1500 years of the Common Era, perspectival consciousness slowly germinated within the predominantly discursive consciousness of the Roman and medieval Christian worlds. As we have already begun to examine, this germination was fueled by a very unique form of moral and emotional orientation which was inculcated by the unconscious dynamics of Christianity. Within Christianized souls, the promise of salvation would lure humanity unto the annihilation of the classical world through the earth-shattering discoveries of inner and outer space. The first awakening of perspectival consciousness at a societal scale began during the 15th century. It was at the dusk of the 18th century, however, that the perspectival structure would achieve its most mature, fully developed form. During the closing decades of the 18th century, we see the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which would initiate the birth of commercial capitalism as a socio-political ideology. Shortly thereafter, the groundbreaking works of Charles Augustin Coulomb and Luigi Galvani would lay the groundwork for the science of electromagnetism, and in the year 1800, Alessandro Volta would create the voltaic pile, the world's first electrochemical battery. This exact same time period would also witness the inauguration of the United States as the world's first modern republic, and the French Revolution would then give rise to the modern polarization of political ideology into left-wing and right-wing affinities. Perhaps most significantly of all, Immanuel Kant would publish the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, thereby establishing the most fully realized articulation of perspectival metaphysics, which would lay the groundwork for virtually all of late modernist political theory, theology, and apologetics of science. By the dawn of the 19th century, however, Kant's successors such as Goethe, Hegel, Schelling, and Fichte would have already begun to scrutinize the limits of Kantian metaphysics and to envision how we must proceed in escaping from the inner prison which the perspectival ego had become. The advent of perspectival consciousness would prove to be the awakening of an immense power within the human psyche. Due to perspectivism's fundamentally physicalistic experience of nature and its capacity for extremes of mental abstraction, which would facilitate the notions of energy and interchangeability, the modern age would come to be characterized by extremely rapid developments of machine technology and an equally rapid mechanization of human social relationships. Although perspectival consciousness was born in Christian Europe, it would rapidly come to spread itself to each and every continent on our planet, planting its seeds in virtually all human culture forms across the globe. Through the mechanistic developments of industrial technology, capitalism, and modern bureaucracies, perspectivity would spread from the insulated backwater of medieval Europe to become a power of truly planetary proportions. In order to continue unfolding this mystery, we must next look even deeper into the ways in which Christianity came to renegotiate the relationship between subjectivity and alterity, between selfhood and otherness. In doing so, we will begin to reveal the true scope of the unfolding narrative that is the modern age and what lies beyond it. To paraphrase a rather famous quote, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of modernity. In what follows, we will be attempting to imagine both, and we will do so by looking as deeply as we possibly can into the internal abyss which Petrarch so fatefully discovered on Mount Ventoux. Thanks for watching.